Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell you scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse wherever you stream podcasts. Just be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. In this milestone 250th episode of the Red Treehouse, I'm going to narrate a terrific short horror story, Cleric, Veins of Garnet, written by Anthony Labriola. This story is a first for the show, a vampire western that's atmospheric, creepy, and a ton of fun to read and narrate. A huge thank you to Anthony for submitting this original story. You can find links to his socials and other info in the show notes. Now it's time to sit back, turn down the lights, pull up the covers, and pay close attention as I narrate Cleric, Veins of Garnet by Anthony Labriola. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse.
With Plan B emergency contraception, we're in control of our future. It's backup birth control you take after unprotected sex that helps prevent pregnancy before it starts. It works by temporarily delaying ovulation, and it won't impact your future fertility. Plan B is available in all 50 U.S. states at all major retailers near you, with no ID, prescription, or age requirement needed. Together, we've got this. Follow Plan B on Insta at Plan B One Step to learn more. Use as directed.
Cleric, Veins of Garnet, written by Anthony Labriola. Bet they don't have to deal with this out west. Kurt's teeth chattered beneath his frost-tipped beard as he smiled. His attempt at good humor fell on the deaf ears of his fellow miners, none breaking the rhythm of their picks to even pay him any mind. The rhythm was their only warmth in the drafty caverns. You'd have to be lazy or a fool to stop. Kurt as Cleric never fancied himself either. Ma Cleric just raised him friendly. And that just wasn't everyone's cup of tea in the new world. The winters in the New York mountain ranges were new to all of them, but it was the price they paid for freedom, or so that's what they told themselves for fortitude. The winter wind howled down the mine shaft, a hungry beast ready to claim any whose hearths weren't kept warm or whose pelts weren't wrapped tight enough. Kurt wiped the sweat from his brow before it had the chance to freeze and cracked his pickaxe back into the gray stone, cleaving away mounds of heavy backfill and hauling them into the cart just a little ways down the track. The cart was near enough to capacity when Kurt emptied his freight that he seized the opportunity to back away from the repetition of chipping and hacking at the dense rocks. He gave a shrill whistle that pierced above the tinking of the axes and pushed his shoulder hard into the side of the cart to get it rolling. It was heavy, but the tracks were slick with ice, so it wasn't long before Kurt had the cart rumbling along the rails behind the other men, whistling all the while to ensure they heard him coming, in part to alert anyone who might be on or near enough to the tracks, but mostly for his own safety to avoid getting picked himself on some absent-minded miner's backswing. The tracks wound through the caverns and down to a deep pit the men had blasted open back in the summer months when the mine had first opened. Even the brightest torches struggled to shed their light down here, and the pit echoed with a loud distortion that made it difficult to think, let alone hold a conversation. So it was only Kurt and a small handful of other men who ever took the shift to empty the carts into it. Some of the men even went as far as to scare superstitions into each other just to avoid the task. Ed Booker would claim the echo wasn't an echo at all. It was the voice of some creature deep below the pit mocking them. Old Dan Simon, whose hatred for the mines only grew from summer to winter, claimed the pit led straight through to the gates of hell itself on account of the strange heat that emanated from it even when the rest of the caverns ran cold. There was no denying the caverns gave Kurt the creeps, but England was full of ghost stories and beast-filled moors. America was no different. To Kurt, stories were all they were there, and surely all they were here. He had a family to provide for, and the mines were the fastest way of doing that. The trappers did well enough and kept folks fed and warmed, but on a single good day, the mines could keep the town prosperous for a whole season. The cavern grew warmer as Kurt trudged his way down the mine shaft. The heat was brimming under his furs as he felt that same cold sweat start to prickle his skin. The stalactites above dripped with winter frost, pooling in the faults and folds of the rocky surface. The runoff of the mine's garnet gave the water a red tint, but folks like Booker and Simon had their own stories about the runoff. They'd say it was blood from the bodies of people buried in the mountainside long ago, seeping deep into the soil, keeping its rich vibrancy until it came out the other side. Most of the superstitious stories the miners passed around the campfire were just that to Kurt. Stories. But this one struck Kurt a little bit harder. They had seen a lot of death on the trail to New York, and there was never much time for stopping. Many of their own dead had been buried unceremoniously along the trail. Some more traditional folks would just haul the dead along with them until there had been enough time to stop and give them a proper service. Because of folks like that, the smell of death and the metallic ting of blood wafted through the caravan, polluting the smell of the lush green overgrowth and wildflowers that populated the way to their new homes. Mining was new work for Kurt. He never pictured himself one for hard labor. He considered himself more the scholarly type. But while the schoolhouses and banks were still timber skeletons and heaps of raw lumber, he'd have a ways to go before he saw himself back in a schoolmaster's position. "Hoo doggy!" We struck a vein. The hooting and hollering of the men broke Kurt from his daydreaming. A vein was a good sign. If they followed the right trail, that could mean hauling carts of garnet out of the mine instead of dragging more backfill down to the pit. The crack of the vein unleashed that potent and familiar ting of death. Kurt hated the smell and tightened his kerchief around his face before dumping the load of backfill down into the endlessly black pit. The echo of the tumbling rocks drowned out the uproar of celebration, but something else captured Kurt's attention. It was difficult to make out what it was through the noise, but it was rhythmic, beating like the cavern had some giant heart buried below. A rush of hot air followed in bursts, and suddenly in chorus, like the screeching of cartwheels, Kurt knew exactly what was coming. "Bats!" he cried out, his voice lost under the pitching screams. The darkness itself seemed to thrash and writhe until it erupted into a geyser of battering wings and hungry mouths. Kurt turned tail fast and ran back up the icy tracks. He fought hard against the swarm that rushed past him, stumbling along the cracked ties, slicing his hand on the jagged cavern walls to break his fall, but to no avail. His head came down hard on the cold iron rail, his vision blurred. Unsure if it was the pulsating loss of his senses or the God's honest truth, as Kurt's vision pulled into focus, he saw a bat the size of a dog, sickly and emaciated, crawling out of the pit. Its leathery wings outstretched with throbbing veins illuminated by the dull amber light of the torches. The heavy rhythmic beating started again, in tandem with the pounding of his head, and Kurt watched as the creature took flight down the mine shaft. Its dark shadow washed over him like the veil of night. Soon, the panic of the other men rose to join the cacophony. Kurt staggered to his feet, his vision still hazy, the gust of the creature's wings having taken much of the torchlight with it as it passed. He felt for the ties beneath his feet and followed them back to the flickering shadows ahead. The noises of aggression and struggle passed through the screeching bats. There was a dense thud as two small shadows flew past Kurt and splattered against the wall. Kurt had known most of these men the whole journey east from Colorado. Hardly anything nature had to offer scared them, let alone brought them to the level of screaming that reverberated along the cavern walls. But if Kurt could trust his rattled brain, what he saw, that thing, it wasn't natural. They were too deep in the twisting labyrinth for anyone outside to come to their aid, and everyone who knew the tunnels was already inside. Kurt rounded the corner to the newly struck Garnet vein, its glittering crystals now stained with a wet layer of crimson. "Cleric, run!" A spark of flame hissed to life in old Dan Simon's hand. The smell of sulfur was quick to permeate the smell of death, but the creature had its bony claw wrapped tight around his neck. Kurt trailed the still cavern torches back as fast as his legs could carry him, praying the creature wouldn't divert its attention toward him. But the bats were quick to give him chase, dashing out the torches as they flew. Mere seconds passed when Kurt heard the crack of dynamite echo and felt the cavern floor shake beneath him. The walls rumbled and roared. Stalactites dropped and shattered. Kurt glanced over his shoulder as he ran, watching as the cave swallowed up any hope he might have had that his companions would get the chance to return to their families. The supports of the tunnel rattled loose from their bindings. Heavy planks teetered and toppled over one another, narrowly missing Kurt on their way down. The rails groaned and popped from the pressure. A fissure caused by the explosion tore the very ground that held them in two. Pale moonlight poured into the mouth of the mine, but a great many shadows gathered at the sound of the explosion. "Get back! It's not safe!" But not a shadow backed away from the danger. Kurt fell to his knees as he exited the cave and stared back in horror, finally letting the full truth of what he had just witnessed sink in. Familiar faces crowded around him, shouting and stammering an incoherent stream of questions. A small head propped itself beneath his arm, and two small hands wrapped around his waist. "Dad! Dad!" Kurt was unresponsive, his eyes transfixed on the dark, praying another would emerge after him, his ears tuned to the quiet sounds of night. A scream would have been more reassuring. He felt his body lifted from the ground, forced away from the sight, carried off elsewhere, the small voice grunting beneath the burden of his weight. The scenery passed him by as he went. Faces came in and out of view. Voices rambled ceaselessly. But all that crossed his mind as he went was that there went the inn Booker would prattle on about, awaiting the day he could host exotic guests with tales of far-off lands. There went the church Dan Simon swore he'd get to when he got sober, always wishing for the chance to get back in the Lord's good graces. Kurt hoped his sacrifice would be enough. He hoped that whatever God there was, if there was one, wouldn't begrudge an old man a chance at happiness. But hope turned to mortal dread as the cross on the steeple disappeared from his sight. His heart pounded, fists clenched, teeth grit as his mind fixed on the thought of that devil in the cave, dragging the souls of those men down into that black pit of fire. He screamed and thrashed. His elbow collided with something solid, and his support fell from beneath him. Lizzie. He hit the dirt and came face to tear-stricken face with his own daughter, who had carried him all the way to their front door. She threw her head into his chest and wept. An older gentleman, Sheriff Gideon, pushed through the crowd and fired off a warning shot. "Well, what are y'all gawking at? There's just been a cave-in. We need every able-bodied person digging through that rubble post-haste." His gruff voice didn't carry as far as it used to, but those who heard him shepherded the others away. "No!" Kurt clambered to his feet, bracing himself on the sheriff's arm. "You can't do that." "Don't go in there. It'll kill you," he stammered through his words. Everything about his stance shouted except his voice, a quiet muttering, hardly coherent, in the time-worn sheriff's ear. Sheriff Gideon helped Kurt back into the house. Her father's words still fresh on the wind. Lizzie Cleric's attention was drawn to the brave folks digging into the collapse. She muttered to herself. Sheriff Gideon brought Kurt a cup of water from the basin, but his hands trembled, cracked and caked in blood, crystallized from the cold. He continued to mutter incoherently to himself. The dark. The dark. The moving dark. The muttering grew louder, but when Kurt had finished rambling about the dark, he instead listed the names of his fellow miners. Booker, Simon, Hewlett, over and over and over again at a maddening pace. Cooper, Layton, Benjamin, until his whispers grew to shouts, then finally uncontrollable screaming. His terror was cut short as Sheriff Gideon laid a mean right hook into his jaw. Dang it, Kurt. Those men are still in there, and if we're gonna rescue them safe and proper, I need answers. At this, Kurt's screaming turned to laughter. Awful, mocking laughter. They're dead. They're all dead. It killed them. Lizzie was always the curious type, wandering off into the wilds instead of tending to her chores. The sheriff's interrogation of her father droned on behind closed doors. Lizzie could see where the entrance of the mines used to be from the front porch. Now it was crowded with people hauling heavy stones, tossing them carelessly into the backs of ass-driven wagons. The droves of carts seemed never-ending. Absent-mindedly, almost hypnotically drawn to the disaster, Lizzie peered into the mouth of the mines, but she snapped out of her trance-like state as she was shoved aside by a young man fighting against his stubborn ass to move the cart of heavy stones. The poor beast's hooves sank into the mud under the weight of it, brayed wildly, thrashing and gnashing until the young man had no other choice but to release it from its harness. It reared up and bucked at the cart, loosing the stones tumbling back into the cavern, stirring the other work animals into a frenzy. "We found a body," a voice called deeper within the mines. Body. The words echoed in Lizzie's mind. She watched as some of the other townsfolk gasped and held each other close, praying their own were still something more than just bodies beneath the rubble. The bark of a dog rang out next. What is that? The same voice seemed to call out to no one in particular. The rumble of stones falling loose followed. Then a cloud of screaming darkness peeled out as hundreds of bats blotted out the sky, sending all who lingered inside the cave trampling over one another to get by. The beating of their wings and the ear-piercing screech forced Lizzie to duck for cover, holding her hands over her ears, bringing her back to the days when she was younger and her father would cover her ears as she feared the sound of thunder, but could not resist the sight of the lightning that followed. She watched as the winged creature swarmed the people as they passed, before arching up to the sky, swirling like a storm cloud overhead. Suddenly, she felt a dull thump followed by a sharp tug upon her hair. One of the creatures had gotten itself stuck in her hair. She yelped and frantically swatted at the creature at first, but after a deep breath and a moment of composure, she couldn't help but think of how scared the bat must be, separated from the others, caught in an unnavigable tangle of thick hair. It continued to flutter wildly, but Lizzie took a firm grasp of it and tore it mercilessly from its confinement with no regard for her own pain or small trickle of blood that followed. She tossed the creature skyward to reunite with its colony. When the screeching stopped and the dark cloud had dispersed, the rhythmic thumping of footfalls approached from within the cave. Her focus stayed firmly on the dark, or more specifically, the two men walking out from it and the body they carried with them. He was dressed like one of the miners, but no one stepped forward to claim him as their own. Looks of confusion spread through the masses. Most everyone knows everyone's business in a settlement as small as Wista. Strangers passed through from time to time, and the settlement was still growing. but hardly anyone ever traveled through Wista alone. Confusion transformed to shock as the body's feet began to trudge along the mud, marching to the rhythm of the men that carried it. He was young. He looked to be just old enough to work the mines. Blood covered his shirt, but his chest heaved with life. His eyes flickered open. A hush fell over the townsfolk. They waited eagerly to hear what the stranger might have to say about the incident. At that moment, the door of the Cleric house swung open and Kurt came stumbling out, plodding face first into the dirt. "If you ain't gonna give me nothing to work with, Kurt, I got no other choice but to hold you till you got some sense backing you." Sheriff Gideon stood over Kurt. His sleeves rolled and his knuckles bloodied. "You." The stranger's voice croaked as it drew an accusatory finger toward Kurt. The stranger broke free from the grasp of his aides and picked Kurt up by the collar of his shirt, like a scolded pup being shamed in the streets. "He did this. This damned fool tossed a whiskey stick 'neath the bearings." The stranger's words were brief, but they held a power over their audience, igniting something deep within them. I... Kurt stammered, but the jeers of his fellow men made it difficult to think. The sound was too much. Kurt turned and locked eyes with the piercing, hate-filled gaze of the stranger. For a moment, Kurt swore he recognized the fellow, but his mind was quickly assaulted once again by the horrific visions of what he had witnessed inside the mines. His panicked heart raced, and in his nervousness his fit of laughter resumed. Everyone looked on in disgust and outrage. Some even began to hurl stones at him. This was as good as a confession of guilt to the unruly mob. Sheriff Gideon grit his teeth and grabbed Kurt from the stranger. "This true, Cleric? You got one chance." The grizzled old sheriff spoke through his teeth. Lizzie couldn't make out what was being said across the way, but her heart sank as her father dropped to his knees and grew quiet. "That settles it. It won't bring back the good men we lost in today's tragedy, but there is retribution in blood. Curtis Cleric, for the crimes of murder and sabotage, I sentence you to swing." The sheriff's speech, the sheriff, the stranger, and Kurt were lost in the emblazoned passion of the rowdy crowd. They swarmed Kurt, bloodthirsty. Lizzie fought hard against the mob, but no amount of pushing and shoving would open a path wide enough for her to weave through. The chaotic townsfolk moved as one, an unstoppable beast that now carried her father to the gallows right before her eyes. Any last words? Sheriff Gideon called out a show of superiority to the people, more than an earnest question. It's too late. Kurt never broke his gaze with the stranger. Not when the rope had been tightened around his neck. Not when the sheriff gripped his hand around the lever. Not even when his own flesh and blood, 15-year-old Elizabeth Josephine Cleric, cried out in a voice loud enough to silence the unified voice of the many. The stranger took notice. He turned his gaze toward her, and an icy chill of fear froze her to the spot. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. Lizzie cried herself to sleep that night. Lanterns flickered in the night outside her window as the rest of the town carried on digging for the bodies of the lost miners. A cold wind rattled the window, startling her awake in the dark hours of the early morning. Dazed and praying the tragedy of the day had only been but a nightmare, Lizzie sought out her father. His bed was empty. So was the rocking chair where he'd often spend late nights pondering over his collection of curious volumes. No fire had been lit in their stove that night, and not a single person in all of Wista came to check on the young girl who now lived in this strange new settlement all alone. She thought fondly on the stories her father would share with her after each book he had finished, on all of the time and care he took to teach her letters and numbers, about the stars and the earth, about all the strange and new animals they saw from their home in Hampshire to the arduous trek from Colorado into New York. Her father had always kept her sharp-grinned and sharper-witted. She never grew tired of how he would remark at how different the rabbits were from back home. and yet the foxes were exactly the same. It wasn't lost on Lizzie how many of the other travelers she came to Wista with would also sit around the campfire listening, learning, and laughing with her and her father. Her thoughts turned sour, and her stomach turned sick as she thought of her poor father strung up to be gawked at and spat upon like some common criminal. Lizzie may not have known much about the workings of the world, but she knew her father, and she knew that this wasn't the justice he deserved. Whispers passed her front door, gossip spreading like wildfire. Lizzie had been marked by her father's actions. She would be forced to fend for herself in isolation or leave Wista altogether, but it was a long way back to Colorado. The cold she felt from the winter night in the drafty cabin subsided as rage filled her heart. The lanterns continued to swing to and fro as they came and went from the mine across the way. Each one a fair weather friend, each one responsible for her father's injustice, each one a murderer. Lizzie grit her teeth and grabbed her father's skinning knife. She would see to it he got a proper burial. Maybe not as lavish as the ones back in Hampshire, but she'd build him a pine box herself if she had to. She'd dig till her hands bled. But most importantly, she'd be sure he looked like himself when he went to heaven, in his best duds and not covered in mud. She stormed out the front door, making a display of how hard it slammed against the cabin. Yet not a soul turned its lantern's light toward her. The gallows weren't far from home. Nothing was in the mining towns, and if the sheriff wanted to stop her, he'd have to lock her up. The pale moonlight reflected off the snow-dusted earth. Wista was shrouded in an eerie blue glow, and all the roads but the road to the mine were empty. Shadows loomed in circles high overhead. The bats had returned, but they made no sound. They scarcely beat their wings as they glided gently around the moon. A weight formed in Lizzie's throat as she approached her father, gently swaying, his boots knocking against the gallows. The knife in her hand trembled, and the strength stripped from her bones the closer she stepped. She ascended the stairs, looking out over Wista. Quiet as she tried to tread, her footsteps echoed across the high platform. She steadied her hand and grabbed at the taut rope that dangled her father lifeless above the ground. It was coarse and thick, but her father's knife kept a keen edge and bit into the rope with ease. Its silver blade glinted in the moonlight. As each strand of rope broke, it gave up its hold on Kurt's weight. Lizzie struggled to hold it, but as the last strand split, it burned through her palms and Kurt fell to the ground with a heavy thud and a wet, splintering crack. Lizzie peered over her shoulder to see if anyone could be bothered to be alerted by the sound, and still no one. Her blood boiled and tears welled up in her eyes. She choked them down with that heavy weight in her throat and steeled her nerves as she clenched the gash in her left palm by the hangman's rope. Lizzie sat her father up against the gallows, fighting back tears all the while. The position looked more natural, more like his old self, but the grim reality had finally set in as she stared down at the bone protruding from his shin, an injury sustained in the fall, that she would never have her father back. She would never sit with him by the fire again. She would never hear the rasp of his voice as he did his best to sing her to sleep with songs he only half knew the words to. There was no spark behind his eyes, no tenderness as his arms fell over her. The weight of him she carried so diligently earlier that day seemed somehow heavier now, immovable. Lizzie's eyes were tired from crying. Her bones ached with cold, and her hand stung as a trickle of blood followed her back to the mouth of the mine, where all the little lights of the people of Wista gathered. A single voice droned over the crowd as Lizzie drew closer. That icy chill of fear ran down her spine once more as she knew it to be the voice of the stranger. But the language he spoke was unlike anything she had heard since she had been to America. In fact, as far as she could recall, it sounded similar to the speech the Reverend used at her grandfather's funeral. She didn't understand it then, and she couldn't understand it now. She refused to let it freeze her to the spot this time. He was to blame for her father's death, And somewhere deep inside her, she knew he must also be to blame for the mine's collapse. But she could not fathom why Sheriff Gideon and the others could not see it. She couldn't fight the strange echo of her father's laughter in her mind. She quickened her pace, her footsteps sloshing in the muddy brown snow until she could see the piercing gaze of the stranger standing atop the Hewlett family's cart. His speech stopped. His lips curled to a smile. His pristine white teeth glinted in the moonlight, protruding toward his lower lip, pointed like fox teeth. A cruel mockery. Without breaking her stride, Lizzie scooped up a gravel-laden fistful of snow and hurled it at him, landing somewhere amidst the crowd. "My father is dead because of you. Do none of you care? Doesn't he deserve a proper burial?" Her voice echoed in the silence. None of the people her father had once considered friends even turned to acknowledge her. The stranger stepped down from the cart, and the crowd parted for him to walk past. As they turned, Lizzie could see the vacant stares in their eyes, empty and sparkless, identical to her father's. They each carried a bucket of bright red stones that shimmered under their lantern's light. She could see the cart as the crowd moved away. On it lay the crushed and mangled bodies of the miners. The sight made her stomach churn. What are you doing to them?" She stammered out the words, trying to feign her confidence. The stranger chirped as he knelt down to stare Lizzie in the eyes. She could feel the power emanating from behind them, probing at her thoughts. She clenched her fists tighter. The pain kept her focused. It made her grit her teeth in defiance. His concentration broke first. His eyes panned over to the knife in her hand. He took hold of it, forcefully and uncaring that the blade slid along the creases of his finger. With an unnatural bend of his wrist, he pried the blade from her hand, revealing the fresh wound in her palm. The stranger inhaled deeply, savoring the smell. "This life is wasted on your kind, little one. Narrow thoughts of death's finality. There is so much more." The spark in his eyes burned brighter than the brightest lantern light, reflecting snow and moonlight and garnet and blood in brilliant iridescence. Movement beneath the bloody sheet sprawled out within the carriage startled Lizzie. She stumbled back on her heels. He dropped the blade at her feet, yet no blood flowed from the open cuts in his hand. She could see an unexpected twinge of pain in the stranger's eyes as black smoke rose from the wounds. It smelled of ash and sulfur. "What are you?" "I am what lies beyond eternity, and all of Wista will become a part of me." The stranger spread his arms outstretched to the sky, and the swirling cloud of bats burst into chaos, descending on the people of Wista. The shambling corpses loaded their buckets of garnet into the cart as the stranger turned his back to her and mounted the massive black Frisian at the head of the cart and drove off. Unaware her body had already begun to carry her out of harm's way, Lizzie paced back from the swarm of bats, from the shambling mangled corpses, from the mindless horde. She was completely and utterly alone, and terror-stricken beyond words. Lizzie could not peel her eyes from the carnage of the scene. She had never heard of bats feeding on people, but the longer she watched, the less she understood what she was seeing. The bats contorted and formed into grotesque humanoid visages. Every victim they sank their fangs into followed. Their limbs twisted in unnatural ways. Bones cracked and splintered, writhing beneath flesh, until they resembled inhuman beasts unlike anything Lizzie had ever seen before. There was no doubt in her mind that Wista belonged to the devil. It always had. Devils and monsters, ghouls and revenants, her father had always taught her were just fairy tales, superstitions held by people who were scared they wouldn't make the most of the one life they got. But as much as she looked at him like he knew everything, there was no denying the truth of the horrors that stormed the streets of Wista under the pale full moon. They raked and tore at the town. All the hard work she had watched everyone come together to create laid in ruins. Lanterns were tossed carelessly into houses. The creatures bore down on the livestock in droves, reducing entire oxen to bloodless husks in seconds. One such creature ran toward Lizzie with ferocious speed, awakening her natural instincts. She ran at a full sprint, but its leathery wings took to a low glide, and its shadow enveloped her. She screamed for help and thrashed against the beast, but as it drew her airborne, she clung to it for fear of plummeting to her death. The bird's eye view of Wista was no better. She could see the grand scope of things, how outnumbered she was, how hopeless the fate of Wista was, and how far along the stranger had already made off with his cart of Garnet. "What do you want from me? I have nothing left!" she cried out, letting loose all her frustration, anger, and sadness all at once. The creature landed her inside the skeleton of what was meant to be the new church on the hill. It approached her slowly and extended a gnarled claw to her. Smoke emanated from its wings, and pain filled its eyes as it dropped strands of familiar hairs before her. Mercy given, where mercy shone. Its voice screeched and groaned all at once, filling every spectrum of its vocal register. A trail of dust formed where its wing began to burn away. The injured creature took flight away from the town, and down the same path the stranger had traveled. Lizzie picked up the strands of hair and grasped at the spot she had taken mercy on the small bat earlier that day. She sat in the empty half-built structure and questioned what good it would do her. Could the god she grew up believing in really have power over living, breathing devils? If one side was real, the other must be, she thought. But what could she do? The church hadn't had 4 walls yet, let alone a congregation or holy relics. The reverend had blessed the ground so they could bury their dead, and Lizzie herself only knew enough prayer to get her through supper and bed. Someone had to do something, and if those shambling corpses were any indication of what these creatures were capable of, she'd have to act fast if she was going to keep them away from her father's body. Lizzie scoured through the build site for anything that could be worthwhile, just enough to get her out of a tough situation if she needed to. There wasn't much to gain from the site, but a hammer and nails helped her put together a handy crucifix and a stick of dynamite. Well, she saw what it did to the top of the mountain. She heard what it did to the mines. God or no God, it had to count for something. Lizzie raced down the hill towards the back roads and behind the jail. As she was making her descent, she noticed some of the creatures taking flight down the path of the stranger, beyond the church, and disappearing somewhere into the dark forest. The commotion still rose over Wista, drawing the attention of some of the creatures from the wild. Coyotes howled over the blood-curdling shrieks and collapse of buildings. As Lizzie drew nearer the back of the jail, she witnessed one of the creatures tugging and tearing at the limp body of a young man. But without the head, she could not be sure who. And at the other end were 2 coyotes attempting to drag the body back toward the woods. The creature placed a forceful claw down through the stomach of the corpse, severing it in 2, and reaching its other claw around one of the coyotes. The sight made Lizzie sick to her stomach. She lurched and dry-heaved. The sound alerted the creature to her presence. The other coyote selfishly made off with what it could of the corpse, while the other yelped in the tight grasp of the creature's claw. Lizzie choked down her nausea and fear. It burned in her throat. But she wasn't going to just let these creatures do to her father what they had done to that boy. "Get back!" she shouted in, her voice trembling. She clutched for her father's knife, but her defiance only emboldened the creature as it rose up to its full height, looming over her, the warm saliva rolling off its tongue and coating her hair. As it confidently arched itself in closer for a taste, she grabbed the slimy purple tongue and slashed. Its fangs slammed down like a bear trap, fast enough to shatter bone, but not fast enough to catch Lizzie Cleric. She could see it try to force a scream as it dropped the struggling coyote, but only black smoke and silence rose from its gaping maw, and the one slime-soaked tongue in her hand dried up and shriveled to dust. The coyote snapped and snarled at her before turning its attention to the creature responsible for the deep red gouges around its neck. Lizzie heard the gnashing of teeth and the tearing of flesh, but couldn't bear to see what would happen next as she raced around the front of the building to find her father. She breathed a sigh of relief as her father remained where, and most importantly how, she had left him. Wista crumbled around them, but the creature seemed occupied. Their attention was fixed on those who had not been fully turned, tearing into their throats, draining them of their vitality, and leaving ancient withered husks in their wake. There were too many of them, and their numbers were only rising as the people of Wista begged on bended knee for their lives, only to become the very beasts they feared. Not all were hell-bent on bloodshed. Lizzie noticed many of them turning their attention to the spilled buckets of the red gemstones. Sustenance and order seemed to pale in comparison to the compulsion of the stones. Lizzie knew they were valuable. Wista was built off of the town's profits from the Garnet mines. But what value could they have had to these creatures? What could be worth so much that they would decimate the entire town for the stranger to just leave with them? They fought one another tooth and claw over them, leaving their own dead in their wake, devouring the stones like decadent fruits. She hadn't understood why these stones were so important to the creatures, but all that mattered was that they were important enough to kill their own kind, and that set Lizzie's gears turning. As the creatures piled atop one another for the stones, tearing them from each other's bellies, Lizzie stepped out of the shadows, cross held aloft, and gave a whistle. All eyes turned toward her, the blood of her wound staining the pine, its metallic scent tickling the creatures' upturned noses. She shouted her supper prayer on hope alone that it would drive the creatures back, and for a moment it did. They arched back with a snarl. Lizzie took the opportunity to grab a handful of the largest and brightest chunks of stone she could find and hurled them into the mouth of the mine. They rattled and echoed as they went, and the enraged creatures followed after. Lizzie gave chase as they swarmed back inside, hurling each stone she came across inside. One of the larger creatures seemed displeased with Lizzie's handling of the stones and expressed so with a piercing screech as it towered over her. It bore its fangs, dripping in red as it drew closer to her. She raised her cross and began to chant once more, but in a fell swoop, the creature's claw laid waste to the meager pieces of scrap lumber. It pressed the claw firmly against her, pinning her to the cave wall. She felt the air leave her lungs on impact, and the creature's ever-pressing claw made it harder to draw fresh breath in. She struggled to reach for the blade once more, but her arms were too restricted to grasp it. The creature plucked a remaining shard of garnet from her hand. Lizzie watched through fading vision as the solid gemstone melted on the creature's tongue into an all-too-familiar crimson liquid, and an acrid mist the smell of rust drifted from it. Lizzie felt her grip slipping, her ability to fight leaving her. The creature's sharp fangs drew nearer, and all went black. She could hear the continuous screeching and tearing echoing through the mine, but everything sounded muffled and distant. Her body shook with the second impact, sudden but freeing, her lungs filling with the dank air of the mines, and all of her senses rushed back to her. She could hear her own heartbeat as the blood quickly rushed back through her body. She heard what sounded like a scream, but it transitioned into a series of short bursts, a bark. Lizzie staggered to her feet and saw the small, beaten coyote standing between her and the creature. The creature clutched its arm where the coyote had wounded it, as it stumbled deeper into the mine. Lizzie had to act fast before the brave pup would be too far gone and the other creatures would notice it. She took the shards of the broken crucifix, rushed down the cavern, and drove them through the creature, one beneath the fleshy part of its jaw to seal its fangs shut, and the other through its heart. The creature writhed in agony and reeled as its flesh seared from its bones, melting into a stinking heap of rot on the ground. The wailing and barking drew the attention of the others. Lizzie heard their claws scraping against the cavern walls, followed by the beating of their wings as they took flight. They would bear down upon them in no time. The coyote's fur stood on end as it held its ground. Lizzie couldn't bear to leave it behind, so she took what remained of the charred pine cross, whistled loud, and ran like hell, hoping it would follow. Lizzie rushed out of the mine, the coyote bounding steadily after, but the moving darkness behind them trailed like their very shadows. When it looked like the way was clear enough, Lizzie ducked down and held the wounded coyote tight. She muttered a quiet prayer to herself. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. She struck a match and set her only whiskey stick hissing down the mine shaft and into the moving darkness. The force of the explosion so close to the mouth itself caused the remaining bracers to splinter and collapse, caving in on the horde of creatures before they could re-emerge from the very prison that held them for so long. Lizzie surveyed the wreckage of the town she called home. Smoke rose in plumes mingling with the darkened sky above. The bats dispersed. Glass glittered like ice in the frost-covered earth. Carnage littered the street. No doubt what the coyotes don't haul off in the night, the vultures will pick off in the day. These people turned their back on her, but they were still people. At least most of them were. Wista didn't deserve this. Lizzie battled her thoughts of what to do next. Now she was truly alone. Not a soul but hers remained in Wista. She laid eyes on her father and mustered what strength she had left to carry him. He was impossibly heavy now, his body rigid and unbending. His skin was cold and ghastly pale. His eyes were clouded white. Lizzie strained under the weight of him, but got to the foot of the hill before it dragged her down. Her knees buckled, and the tears she had fought so hard to hold back now flooded forth in a deluge. Her body, racked with aches and sadness, shivered as the cold wind cut through her. Her hand stung, but she drove her fist into the dirt in rage, wondering now what the point of any of it was, wondering why they ever had to leave Hampshire or Bent's Fort for Wista, wondering how that horrid creature could call letting her live a mercy. It was cruel. As the tears fell from her cheeks, Lizzie felt something warm her face. A wet tongue traveled to her bloodshot eyes as they opened to meet the pleading eyes of the coyote. Its nose nudged against her father's limp hand, and its teeth tugged at the collar of his shirt. The little pup had been beaten, bloodied, and bruised in the fight, but its spirit was far from broken. It dragged Kurt's body a little ways up the hill until Lizzie picked herself up and dragged along with it. Screams of anguish cut through the night for hours after the collapse. Lizzie could hear them all the way from the churchyard as she and the coyote sat at the top of the hill where her father would finally know peace. The frigid earth was like breaking stone, and the reverberations of the shovel made Lizzie's bones ache. But with each scrape of her shovel against the ground, her coyote companion raked its claws deeper to lighten the load. Lizzie smiled. If you're gonna stick around, I'm gonna need to call you something. Suppose I call you Mercy. The sun was rising just over the tree line as Lizzie savored her final moment with her father, clutched close in her arms. Daylight cast along the dirt road leading into the forest, and Lizzie's thoughts turned to the stranger and to all the ways she would make sure she got the justice she was owed. What did you think of this terrific short vampire western horror story? Comment or email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. A special thanks to Anthony Labriola for submitting it. And if you're listening, be sure to follow his work. You can find links to his social media pages and more in the show notes. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, be sure to join me next time as we continue exploring our strange and scary world. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.